to just barely touch it. So what I'm interested in is not really people, but how they work, how the community work, and how people belong to patterns of things. So not individuals doing stuff, but members of groups, and how they tell us things about how communities work. In the same way, I'm much more interested in design as a way of understanding communities and how different communities interact. And in our environment, you might think about communities of clients, of makers, of consumers of information, of different communities that interact to handle a bit of information in different instances. That for me is interesting because it helps me think about the value of design. Now, in most cases, people think of design as an applied profession where there is a specific output. It might be a piece of physical printing or something that you can point a finger at. That for me is not very interesting because it means then that this object that you produce embodies the value of the work. And that is, I think, a trap because the way things are going, we have increased automation and quite a lot of intelligence that is programmatic that goes into doing bits of design. So a lot of stuff that we thought were part of human activity are now automated to large degrees. If then the object still embodies the value and I can make the object through of machine intelligence, then where's the value in the designer? Why do I need a designer? That's a bit of a problem. It's more of a problem for the younger people in the audience because that's your career ahead of you. And if you haven't figured out that question, then you've got some troubled years ahead. To give you some idea, there's a huge amount of work, this already 2 years old or something, that automates a lot of typographic production through a browser. And I think most of the important things have to be considered through a browser because this is where most of the growth in the consumption of documents is. So something that would be a typographic expertise indicator, which would be the good typography of the right kind of quotes, the right kind of punctuation, the right kind of microspacing, can now be automated. That means that the person that you would pay to do this now is out of a job. You don't have to pay them and you can still get good typography. A lot of platforms, this is medium.com, spend a lot of effort in producing typographic environments that are good enough. Now, we're not talking about things that might be at the highest level of expertise, but what you need for something to be a successful product is for it to be good enough. So if you can get a browser-based environment that produces good enough typography, you don't need to pay anyone to produce this good enough bit of web design. It does it on its own. If you're a web content provider whose job is based on producing sort of good enough work, you're out of a job. If you can make a good video connector, you might have a longer career. Let's see. Please. There, don't move it. Okay, does this work? Yes. April 15, 2 years old, this thing already, 2.5 years old. And there's more of these things. Automated document production. So you have an intelligent system that will compose a complex document and will typeset the document for you. If Peter Caro was in the room, he would say, there's nothing new there, I did this in the 70s. Yeah? And indeed he did. It was too early to market properly, but there are a lot of people who are doing things like this now. So if that you have a career as a document typesetter, again, there's somebody else making a machine that will do this faster and more efficiently than you. And you need to think, where's my job? You look at companies that produce things. You think of Adobe with their Typekit thing, but then you realize that what they're doing here is they're building a font system, font delivery system in your layout application. So they're vertically integrating the fonts and the document producing environment. So if you're a font maker and you're not on Adobe's good books, you might find it more difficult to be part of that system. What you also see here is a repetition in a digital environment of an old model where you had one company producing the typesetting environment and the fonts were part of it. And here there's a company producing the typesetting environment, and the fonts are part of it. So this is completely closed system. At the moment, it's not entirely closed. It's very easy to close it down. So this makes me ask, where's the space for new work? And we have to think about this, especially because in the type world, there is a lot of activity now around new formats and so on. And you often confuse the discussion about innovation with what actually translates to the market. So I stole this slide from Lawrence Penny, where he put a lot of font technologies on the map, and I sort of marked 3 big periods where there is a lot of different changes in, where are we? In the typesetting technologies and the models. And it sort of works like this. We have a model where we're moving from very locked systems, vertically integrated systems, companies that produce, say, a typesetting system where you can also buy some fonts as part of it, then to something that becomes more free and more open, and typefaces are individual products that are a very volatile market that you can actually speculate easily. And now we're moving towards a discussion where things are getting much more centralized again, and you have a consolidation of the market. If you're part of the larger, let's say, providers, that is a good bit of news. If you're an individual typeface designer, that may be bad news. So it depends. So you have to think, where's the market? And the market is outside my hotel window, as far as I'm concerned. Thailand skyline is crazy because the city never ends. It's weird. Whichever way you look, the city goes on forever. But this is the market. This is 1 billion people in that direction, and other people in every direction holding phones, consuming a lot of new documents. And if you consume a lot of documents on a phone, it means that there's a closed system coming down from a server that serves you content down to a browser that you hold. And it makes it extremely easy to lock down the options for fonts and the document environments that you work in. You as a user, you don't know it's a closed system because you're consuming anything you choose, but what you choose is predetermined. Now you can see how this is growing. This stuff is all online. It's very easy to find. So you can see where we are now. Sort of literacy is growing up. The global averages matter. And you can see how there's a huge the world population that is beginning to be much more independent in terms of the interaction with information, which again means things in somebody's hands. You also see, urbanization and disposable income. These are hugely important if you're thinking about the market. People living in close proximity to each other, in a certain regularity of income, that creates disposable income, creates a volatile market for documents. Throughout the world, at different times, you see whenever these situations happen together, the document market explodes. And this is happening in Asia right now in a very big way. Then you see these kind of roots development. They ignore the more developed ones. They're very stagnant and slow economies. But what you see there, if you see Asia, Africa, and so on, you see there's a huge amount of growth capability. And this all happens in devices that are quite independent from each other, with documents that are always served through some sort of environment that is centrally controlled, even if you get the impression of freedom. What is more interesting is that we increasingly have documents for which we don't have a language to describe. So this is a typical case of a collaborative document where you might have the author's voice here, there's an image voice, and here you have a collaboration of the document. You have different voices by readers of the document, perhaps the author themselves, comments. We don't have a typographic language yet to describe these things, and this is a fairly simple environment. If you imagine the same thing in education or in academia, then you get much more complex document structures. It's fascinating stuff, but again, it all is centralized and very vertically integrated. So, what does this mean? 3 things. It means that the making of the stuff and the distributing them trends to 0. Nobody will pay you to make a font. Nobody will pay you to ship a font because somebody else can make it more cheaply than you. You need to think where the value is. The value is not in the object, that is the font file, or in the shipping a font. The value is connected to utility, to the perhaps intangible values that people attach to fonts. So a font that might give a certain identity, that might give a certain brand value, a certain recognition, a certain perception of value to the user. That is what people pay for. And we can see this in how the market has changed with the availability of good enough free fonts available online. This hasn't threatened the independent type market. Arguably, it has strengthened it, because it allows people to recognize where the value is in the fonts that they will pay for. And it might have to do with how different scripts work together, or how specific brands are served for these, and so on. But this is a language that the designers would need to develop further. And that the evaluation, how good something is, what the value is, depends on the context. That the same thing has different values in different markets, different periods, for different users. And if you're a designer who just looks at the shapes you make, you're going to be out of a job. Maybe not here, but definitely in 5 years. Because you need to be able to understand what your shapes mean for specific groups of users, for specific environments, specific documents, and so on. That makes me come to this sort of phrase that I think is key, that typeface design and typography are knowledge professions. They're about handling information, accumulating information and experience, learning from how you do things and how people interact with your work, and capitalizing on it. Never asking the same questions twice. Whoever understands this better has the longest career and the safest career ahead of him. Whoever thinks that they're still making shapes, I think misses the point. Now, what does this mean for typeface design as a field? In practice, this is what people like me see. So there's a huge amount of people designing things, and there's a relatively small number of people who are talking about stuff, and so on. Although, and the new program that's going to start here is an example of this. And traditionally, there's a little bit of research somewhere on the side, which often is self-contained. It talks to itself. It might be very historical, but without necessarily enough connections. And there's something called practice-based research, which, depending on the educational context you're looking at, might be very different. So a good example of this is this. This is Beowulf. It is a font done by Jus van Rossum and Erik van Blokland, never used outside probably this article in Emigre, which essentially has a program that modifies the outlines for each instance of each letter. So the E is never exactly the same E, and so on. Now, at the time this was done, it was done as an experiment to see what you could do with, how far you could push the idea of a single font. Was this recognizably one font? Was it many fonts? What is the identity of a font? What are the limits of understanding something? At the time this was fresh. However, if we see things like this, we will see that people who look at the early typefaces are asking exactly the same question. Because you have metal type that gets worn, you have type that gets modified a lot depending on the imprint. You might have a lot of typefaces that are quite hybrid in their composition, from printer to printer or from signature to signature. So the idea of what is a typeface by Aldous or by Jensen is also something fluid. And you really have to look at periods, say, from the 1740s onwards to have an idea of a fixed typeface, and certainly a post-19th century idea for a typeface that looks always the same until we have examples like that. So you could say that people experimenting with the limits of what we accept as a typeface are doing that kind of research. Where things are changing is this. So I've got sort of M making is machine making. We're talking about HAL and stuff. Increasingly, we produce more and more documents, but they're made automatically. Nobody actually makes the documents. People make systems that make documents. If I go on an Amazon page, that page doesn't exist until I click on something, and then some machine assembles stuff, reads my profile, and builds a completely unique page that nobody else will ever see. And actually, I will probably never see again because my profile will have changed the next time I buy something. So this is hugely growing, and there's a much smaller part that actually people are making. So you have to think, how do I create value for that bit? Well, my argument is that you have to do some research. You have to define what research in design is. You have to figure out how does research inform the kind of making that has value beyond what can be easily made by a machine. And that would be the kind of making that recognizes its context, that actually responds to what a community needs, understands and engages with the values of the community. And that is much more difficult to build into a machine. It will also include some sort of discourse, because you need to talk about these things. You need to understand them. You need to work with people who have different perspectives in this. And I'm sort of having trouble figuring out whether these two circles overlap exactly or not, or which way. It doesn't really matter. But the important thing is that you move the simple act of design into something that involves research, involves reflection, involves an engagement with the community and all the ideas that this involves. And you might see us having research as the normal part of doing. Because something that you do that doesn't involve research or this kind of engagement with the community is done by a machine, and you cannot get paid for that. So you might ask questions of, okay, that's an old document, about 500 years old. And if I look at something on my phone, I can see certain things being similar, and these might be the proportions of the x height to the space above or below, or the dimensions of a line that I think are comfortable to read. Now, the obvious question is, if in this environment I can do almost anything I want, why do I end up doing something similar to this? The technology is not a restricting factor here. So it clearly something has to do with the community, understanding how people work, understanding how easily perhaps readers change their habits, or how certain document types impose certain expectations. So the idea is an essay or fiction or something that requires immersive reading creates expectations in the readers to look at type that looks a specific way for that kind of generation or that kind of market or that kind of moment and so on. So typeface design and typography, they're not part of the arts. They are part of applied humanities. They are applied because they exist in a market. They involve budgets, they involve technologies of making, they involve clients and deadlines and all of that stuff that make life have a certain pressure and relevance to today. But they also have a deep connection with the values of each community and the way we think about ourselves, the way we act. And I think if you ignore that kind of dimension, then you're putting yourself in danger. Now, challenges and opportunities. This means that design is more difficult. It's not just about using the tools. It's about understanding people, understanding the context, and being in a situation where you constantly think about how you do stuff. You're constantly reflective, and you constantly learn. We can test this because we can see that in typeface design especially, there are quite a few old people being very successful. Now that is quite important because old people get tired more easily, they get fed up more easily, they have other things to do, but they accumulate experience. They become better at understanding the context, at making good enough decisions for a specific community faster and with a higher probability of success than a younger person. So maybe it's not surprising that you see an 80-year-old typeface designer doing something new that a 25-year-old cannot do yet. That's because they're building on this experience. Whereas you don't necessarily find this in a lot of other areas of design, where just the opportunity to ask new questions is what will give the market. The opportunities are, in exactly the charts I showed before, where you have areas where there are communities that are coming into the market, they're consuming more content. What we see happening right now is we're figuring out the limits of what we can do within relatively small formats. This is an entirely new world where 10 or 20 years from now, the documents we produce today will be seen as laughably primitive. But if you consider that in the part of the world where there is the highest proportion of young people entering the market, most people consume most content through a handheld device, that means that what you can do within these proportions is disproportionately important. Way more important than what you can do on a laptop screen or a big desktop screen for somebody sitting in Europe. It means that the bottleneck that is a cellular connection is hugely important. Economy of font formats, of document formats, that's really important. It also means that if you have countries that are not so compact and easy in their geography as European countries are. I mean, European countries are a bit of a joke in that respect. They're sort of all together, clumped, they're small, and they're flat. Stick an antenna in the middle of Germany, you've got the signal there. Try the same thing in Indonesia. It doesn't work. You need a system that will work for a bazillion small islands. Try the same thing in China, where you might have endless distances between cities, and it's too expensive cables between them. So you need a system that will work much more flexibly in much more tight systems. All of that stuff matters. It also means that all of these people are growing into a new market without the weight of the previous conventions. So maybe you're designing educational resources for these communities with a lower level of expectations of how things should look, which means your community is more open to new ideas. So how do you take advantage of this? How do you get to expose people to new ways of working with things, taking advantage of the technology? That stuff will not be done by people like me. That stuff will probably be done by people who are on the ground there and have a good understanding of those communities. Ask the right kind of questions and engage with people. And that is where the interesting things will happen. So if anything, I think we are at the beginning of a period of very rapid transition. Very rapid growth, redefinition of what a document is, and again, what the typographic language that we use is, a much more flexible understanding of how we use typographic resources in our everyday language, but also very deep changes in the market of who produces what for whom and how are things being paid or not paid, and which are the things that we are paying for and which are the things that we assume they're part of a general service. I don't have many answers for these things yet. I mostly have questions, but I think that's the interesting state to be in, to have more questions than answers. So I will leave you with that, and thank you very much for your attention.